December 7, 1941. At 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, the base was attacked by 353 Imperial Japanese aircraft in 2 devastating waves. For the thousands of servicemen stationed at the harbor, the morning began not with a drill, but with a visceral transition into total war. The USS Arizona took a direct hit from a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb. The blast ignited the forward magazine, sinking the ship in 9 minutes. Despite the carnage, sailors fought back with whatever they could find, manning guns and battling infernos that threatened to consume the entire fleet. By 10 a.m., the raid was over. The attack killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 others, ending years of American isolationism and pulling the nation into World War II. By 08:10 a.m., the heart of the Pacific Fleet was in ruins. Battleship Row had become a literal sea of fire as thousands of tons of fuel oil ignited, turning the harbor into an inescapable inferno. On the decks of the surviving ships, young men like this sailor witnessed the unthinkable, the instant destruction of the USS Arizona, which took 1,177 lives in a single catastrophic moment. Despite the overwhelming shock, the response was instinctive. Sailors scrambled to unmanned guns, firing at the swarms of Mitsubishi Zeros with anything they could find, from heavy artillery to Browning machine guns. In the midst of the carnage, acts of individual heroism became common. Men risked certain death in the burning, oil-covered waters to save their brothers, regardless of rank or duty. As the second wave of attackers departed, a heavy silence fell over Oahu. The day of peace had ended, and the era of American isolationism had vanished forever, replaced by a grim and unified resolve. By 8 a.m., the first wave of Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes had turned the quiet Sunday morning into a hellish landscape of fire and steel. The primary targets were the pride of the Pacific Fleet, the battleships. Moored in pairs along Ford Island, they were sitting ducks for the highly trained Imperial Japanese Navy pilots. Individual acts of heroism emerged instantly. Sailors, many still in their sleeping quarters moments before, rushed to man any available guns despite the overwhelming tactical disadvantage. The devastation was both tactical and psychological. In just minutes, the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific had been severely crippled by the surprise onslaught. At 8:10 a.m., an 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb pierced the forward magazine of the USS Arizona. The resulting cataclysmic explosion claimed the lives of 1,177 crewmen in an instant. At 8:06 a.m., the USS Arizona was struck. A massive explosion ripped through its forward magazine, creating a fireball that rose 500 feet into the air. In an instant, 1,197 crewmen were lost. For those watching from nearby ships, the world seemed to tear apart in a cacophony of fire and steel. Thousands of tons of fuel oil leaked into the harbor, turning the water into a floating inferno that trapped many who jumped overboard to escape the sinking hulls. Desperation turned to defiance. Sailors fought back with anything they could find, training fire hoses on the flames and manning machine guns against the second wave of attackers. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. In just 2 hours, 2,403 Americans had been killed, and the United States was thrust into a global conflict it could no longer avoid. At 8:10, an armor-piercing bomb struck the USS Arizona, igniting nearly 1 million pounds of gunpowder. The resulting explosion remains one of the most cataclysmic events in naval history. In less than 30 minutes, the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. The harbor was transformed into a landscape of fire, twisted steel, and thick, toxic smoke. Despite the surprise, sailors scrambled to their stations. Many operated manual guns as power failed, firing into the smoke-filled sky at shadows of enemy aircraft. Individual acts of courage defined the morning. Without orders, men fought the spreading fires and rescued shipmates trapped in the suffocating heat of the lower decks. The second wave of 167 aircraft arrived at WWII, focusing on shipyard facilities and cruisers. The attackers aimed to ensure the Pacific Fleet would not sail again for years. By 0830, the first wave of the attack had decimated Battleship Row, turning the quiet Sunday morning into a hellscape of fire and steel. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented. In less than an hour, the backbone of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was shattered. Individual acts of heroism emerged from the chaos as sailors risked their lives to pull comrades from the burning, oil-choked waters. With air superiority achieved, the attackers methodically targeted the remaining infrastructure, ensuring the fleet remained grounded. As the smoke cleared, the world realized that peace had ended. The United States was now at war, and the course of history had been permanently altered. At 8:10 a.m., a 1,060-pound armor-piercing bomb struck the USS Arizona, detonating the forward powder magazine and causing a blast that lifted the 33,000-ton ship out of the water. The explosion was so violent it extinguished fires on nearby ships, but instantly claimed the lives of 1,177 crewmen aboard the Arizona, the single greatest loss of life in U.S. Navy history. Despite the total tactical surprise, sailors across the harbor began a desperate, uncoordinated defense, manning every available weapon to counter the second wave of Japanese bombers. Individual acts of heroism emerged from the chaos. Sailors ignored their own safety to pull comrades from the oil-slicked burning water and fight fires that threatened to consume the entire naval base. By mid-morning, the peace that had defined the Pacific was gone. In less than 2 hours, the United States was forced out of isolation and into the most destructive conflict in human history. By 0830, the primary targets of the Pacific Fleet had been transformed into a corridor of fire and twisted steel. For those on the docks, the sight was incomprehensible, a sudden violent end to a decade of uneasy peace. In less than an hour, the pride of the Navy was decimated, leaving thousands of sailors trapped within the sinking hulls. Shock soon gave way to a desperate, chaotic struggle for survival as men fought to save their comrades from the burning waters. The destruction was far from over. As the first wave departed, a second wave of over 160 aircraft arrived to complete the devastation. At 8:10 a.m., a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb struck the USS Arizona, detonating the forward magazine and creating a catastrophic explosion. The force of the blast lifted the 33,000-ton battleship out of the water, a sight that left many young servicemen in a state of absolute shock. Over 2,000 sailors were lost in a matter of minutes. Those who survived the initial blast immediately scrambled to mount a defense amidst the wreckage. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, consisting of 81 dive bombers, began their descent through the smoke-filled sky to finish the destruction. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. In less than 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet had been crippled, and the nation was thrust into World War II. At 08:06 a.m., the USS Arizona suffered a catastrophic hit. A 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb ignited the forward magazine, triggering a blast that lifted the 33,000-ton battleship out of the water. In mere minutes, the pride of the Pacific Fleet was reduced to twisted steel. The harbor became a furnace as thousands of gallons of fuel oil leaked from ruptured hulls and ignited across the surface of the water. Amidst the carnage, acts of desperate heroism emerged. Sailors ignored their own safety to pull comrades from the inferno, working against time and the encroaching sea on the decks of sinking ships. More than 2,400 Americans lost their lives that morning. The attack lasted only 90 minutes. But it changed the course of global history forever, drawing a sleeping giant into the Second World War. As the second wave departed, a haunting silence began to fall over the ruins of Pearl Harbor. The peace that had existed that morning was gone, replaced by a grim resolve for the long conflict ahead. At 07:48 Hawaiian time, the peace of a quiet Sunday morning was shattered as the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft descended upon the Pacific Fleet. The primary targets were the 8 battleships moored at Ford Island. Within minutes, the USS Arizona suffered a direct hit to its forward magazine, causing a catastrophic explosion. Of the 1,077 crewmen aboard the Arizona, most were lost instantly. Those on the docks and nearby vessels scrambled amidst the carnage to pull survivors from the burning, oil-slicked waters. Despite the total surprise, individual gunners across the harbor began to fight back, filling the air with a desperate curtain of lead and steel against the second wave of attackers. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. 403 Americans were dead. The era of isolationism had ended, and the United States was now at war. At 8:10 a.m., an armor-piercing bomb penetrated the forward magazine of the USS Arizona, igniting over 1 million pounds of gunpowder and creating a shock wave felt across the entire island. For the young men on the decks, the peaceful Sunday morning had vanished into a landscape of fire and metal, leaving them in a state of visceral disbelief. The devastation was systematic. The Japanese air wings targeted the heart of American naval power, aiming to paralyze the Pacific Fleet in a single, decisive stroke. Despite the chaos, instinct and training took over. Survivors fought back with whatever remained operational, from anti-aircraft guns to handheld fire extinguishers. By 10 a.m., the attack was over. 2,403 Americans were dead, and the United States was no longer a spectator in the Second World War. At 7:48 a.m. on December 7, 1941, the peaceful Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor was shattered by the arrival of 353 Imperial Japanese aircraft. The primary targets were the 8 battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Within minutes, the USS Arizona became a tomb for over 1,100 men. Chaos reigned as sailors struggled to man battle stations. Many fought back with whatever weapons were available, facing an enemy that held total air or superiority. Despite the surprise, the response was immediate. Every available gun was turned toward the sky as the second wave of the attack commenced. The attack lasted only 90 minutes, but it claimed 2,403 American lives and propelled a reluctant nation into the global conflict of World War II. At 08:06 a.m., a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb struck the USS Arizona, detonating its forward magazine and creating a shockwave felt across the entire island. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched a 2-wave surprise attack involving over 350 aircraft, aiming to neutralize the United States Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Despite the chaos, American crews scrambled to respond. Gunners began returning fire within minutes, though many ships were trapped in the harbor's narrow channels. Individual acts of bravery defined the morning. Sailors fought through fire and oil to rescue their trapped comrades from the sinking hulls of their ships. By the time the last Japanese planes turned back to their carriers, the peace of the Pacific was shattered, and the United States was pulled into the Second World War. In minutes, the pride of the Pacific Fleet was transformed into a graveyard of twisted steel and incinerated dreams. For those on the ground, the reality of the situation was too immense to process. The peace of a quiet Sunday morning was shattered forever. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed, a blow that crippled American naval power in the Pacific in a single stroke. Instinct soon overrode the initial paralysis. Across the harbor, individual acts of courage began to emerge from the carnage. The attack lasted only 90 minutes, but its impact would propel the United States into a global conflict that would redefine the modern world. At 8:06 a.m., a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb struck the USS Arizona, detonating its forward magazine and creating a catastrophic explosion that redefined the Pacific landscape. For the personnel on the docks, the sight was incomprehensible. In a single heartbeat, over 1,100 lives were lost as the pride of the fleet vanished into the smoke. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma succumbed to a barrage of torpedo hits, rolling completely over and trapping hundreds of men beneath the waterline in a desperate struggle for oxygen. Amidst the chaos, survival instincts took hold. Every man on the harbor became a rescuer, grappling with a reality they had never trained for, a direct aerial assault on American soil. By mid-morning, the peace of the Pacific had been shattered. Pearl Harbor was no longer a naval base, but a graveyard of steel, marking the definitive end of American isolationism. At 8 hours, the peace of a Hawaiian Sunday morning was shattered as the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet became a concentrated target of aerial devastation. For the men on the ground, the transition from routine to total war was a matter of seconds, leaving them in a state of visceral disbelief. Despite the lack of preparation, individual crews began to return fire, mounting a desperate defense against the waves of Japanese torpedo bombers. Survival became the only priority, as sailors ignored their own safety to rescue comrades trapped in the burning oil slicks. As the first wave of the attack subsided, the reality of the damage became clear. The era of isolationism was over, and a new global conflict had begun. By the time the last Japanese aircraft turned back toward their carriers, the United States Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, and the era of American isolationism had vanished forever in the smoke of Oahu.